Hi all, this is a continuation of our analysis of social inequality. Refer to pages 2, 3, and 4 in the second study guide and chapters 7 and 8 in the textbook. Over the last 10,000 years, human social structures have become increasingly complex, and a different sort of inequality has emerged. One among entire categories of people, what social scientists refer to as social stratification. You can find a good working explanation or definition of social stratification on the second page of the second study guide. Social stratification involves people having different access to social rewards as a result of their position within the social hierarchy itself. As is noted over on the next page of the study guide, page 3, think of rungs in the ladder or layers of rock visible on a cliff face, such as this place, the Grand Canyon. In short, people are grouped into strata, layers if you wish, in this case social layers. And people tend to consider those in their own layer as equals, those in any higher levels or layers as somehow superior, and those of lower layers as basically inferior. Such inequality is built into the social structure, and it's basically passed down through the generations. Today, most of humanity lives in stratified societies, and this topic of stratification is certainly one of the more significant subjects in sociology. Systems or forms of social stratification are going to differ from one society to another and over time. You want to remember that social stratification is varied and complex. It may involve all of these variables and others. But again, think in the context of a ladder, if you will. Now, these systems of stratification tend to be grouped under one of two generalized headings: closed or open. A closed system of social stratification is one that is marked by a person's position or status being determined by birth, and it's fixed for one's entire life. You can check chapter 7 in the text, and you'll be introduced to a particular form of closed stratification that is known as caste. And this diagram illustrates the traditional caste system as found in India. In other words, if you or I were born into the pariah caste or the Sutra caste, we would be unable to move upward. Now, there might be considerable movement within each of these two lower castes, but not from one to the other. This is, again, the notion of a closed system. Now, an open social stratification system is marked by boundaries that are a lot more flexible. There are opportunities for people to change and alter their position or their status. One of the better known forms of open stratification is class. In this arrangement, the focus is on where you are based or linked to your economic position or status. That is, the money and material possessions that you have. In chapter 7, your textbook author provides you with a number of the basic elements that make up class. Remember, this is a system of stratification that characterizes the United States. And it's safe to say that all contemporary societies have a class system. It might be envisioned in more or less this way: a ladder. And again, remember, the basis for class is literally, again, the money or economic or material possessions that you happen to have. I've always liked this diagram as an illustration of a class system. Now, one of the things you want to remember about a class system is that it's marked by what's referred to as social mobility. Although one initially assumes or occupies a social class of his or her family, people sometimes can move up or down the class system as their economic situation improves or declines. Now, by way of illustration, you can look at this old drawing that appeared in the newspaper, suggesting again the possibility of social mobility. Likewise, this cartoon illustrates the fact that social mobility is not always upward, it can be downward. Furthermore, as this diagram highlights, social mobility can be lower in countries that tend to be marked by greater inequality. So if you'll notice down at the bottom, where there is quite a lot of income inequality, there's not a great deal of social mobility. And notice the United States happens to be located here, whereas Finland, Denmark, again, social or income inequality, to be more precise, is not as highly marked, but at the same time you have a lot of social mobility. Now, one of the things that is important for you to remember about class membership, and again, if you're having any difficulties or problems, you can find some information about closed and open stratification systems over on the third page of your second study guide. And remember, if you will, that social class membership is extremely significant, and it turns out to be linked to almost every aspect of one's life. Check Chapter 8 and review the consequences of social class. I think it's really important for you to understand that one's social class position within a larger hierarchy is going to impact everything from one's physical health all the way to his or her chances of being arrested. Now, what's long intrigued sociologists is what maintains social inequality. And if you go over to the fourth page of your study guide, there is some information noted roughly about halfway down. This is again on the fourth page, right here, as to some factors that can help to maintain or preserve systems of inequality, as well as social stratification. Let's take a look at two key elements that play an important role here. First and foremost, remember that the powerful control important resources that are necessary to maintain, that is to say, preserve the existing system. Those at the top have the resources to protect their advantaged positions and or acquire even more benefits, while those down at the bottom have few if any advantages to really change their location. Marx and Michaels, Marx on the left, Michaels on the right, supported the idea that the elites, the upper classes, the powerful, work to protect social inequality. Marx noted that the wealthy and the powerful have the best or easiest chance to protect their privileges or benefits. That is, to maintain the way things are right now, the status quo. Michaels, on the other hand, applied his notion of the iron law of oligarchy. And his argument was that in any sort of organization, leaders have a tendency to view their positions as their own, and they set policies and arrangements into motion that establish specific ends or goals that will ensure that they maintain their elite or privileged positions. Now, don't interpret this as the elites getting together and forming in a smoke-filled room a plot to ensure that they can protect their advantages. Remember that dominance, like literally everybody else, powerful folks just like average folks, enter into social networks, webs of social relationships that link someone directly to others, and through these other people indirectly to even more folk. Now, because they occupy the top rungs of the social ladder, the elites, the upper classes, form social networks that provide them with greater access to highly valued resources, including wealth, money, power, prestige, and the like. And even though they're small in number, they have far more greater ability to do things the way they choose to do them. As Robinson puts it, their members have far more leverage in society. And this is not due just to their economic capital. Rather, they also possess what Pierre Baudot refers to as cultural capital. Now, what he means by this is that folks at the upper levels, the highest social classes, have greater access to the most important information, the best education, the highest paying jobs, the most important positions. In addition, they will also have access to insights as to socially approved manners, dress, and language, as well as to knowledge of art, books, travel, vacations, and the like. This diagram kind of illustrates the importance, literally again, of cultural capital. Now, as long as they can control valued resources, the elites can influence, control, occupy the top positions within the economic and political structures. They can maintain, if you will, their class advantage. Now, going back, if you will, to the fourth page, again, highlighting those two factors that help to preserve systems of inequality. One quick thing I wanted to mention to you, as long as those at the top maintain and or increase their resources, the stratification system and social inequality are most likely going to continue. Now, those who are in control, the ruling elites, the dominants, the upper classes, may sometimes employ force, but more often than not, they don't have to. It isn't necessary, since the existing system of inequality becomes, over time, accepted and legitimated. And remember, these existing arrangements aren't just accepted and defended and reinforced by those at the upper levels. They're also viewed in pretty much the same way by people at the lowest levels. So this brings us into the second point, ideologies. There's a working explanation of exactly what ideologies are. Marx highlighted the part that ideologies play in validating and supporting social inequality and social stratification. His argument was straightforward. The dominant ideologies of any society happen to be those of the elites, the dominant, the ruling class. They're always going to justify the economic interest of those people. Members of the lowest social levels tend to accept these ideologies as a result of what Marx called false consciousness, something we talked about a little bit earlier. They're going to support an arrangement or a system that actually puts them at a disadvantage, that exploits them, if you will. And instead of faulting the system for their low position, they're going to attribute their situation to factors over which they think they have no control. Fate, luck, the role of nature. Or they may buy into the argument that if I can't improve my position, there's something wrong with me. Other ideologies also emphasize and justify the privileged positions of those at the top. For example, some ideologies argue they're at the top because they're naturally superior. They're more deserving because they're more talented, they're more educated, they work harder. Or it's entirely possible you could find an ideology that suggests, as Henslin points out in the text, that the existing system is more or less set up or determined by a sacred power or powers. Now, Marx argued that those in the lower social class levels are unlikely to question the legitimacy of the system until they develop what he called a class consciousness, an awareness of their situation and their interest as an oppressed group of people. At this point, he suggested that they'll start developing new ideologies which justify their own class interest. But those at the upper levels are going to view this as a threat. The result is conflict and change. By way of illustration, and wrapping up, think for a moment about Western colonialism. Western powers invaded other societies, exploited the labor and the wealth of the natives, and their actions were in large part justified by ideologies. The ruling class of colonists weren't considered invaders, conquerors, exploiters. Rather, what they were doing was an unselfish act. They were carrying on their shoulders what Richard Kipling referred to as the white man's burden. They had the difficult, demanding job of civilizing inferior peoples. And often again, there were cartoons that defended this, such as civilization fighting again against Arabism. Now, for a time, the conquered peoples seemed to have accepted their situation, and large native populations submitted to the will of a small number of colonial settlers. This is a somewhat humorous illustration of the white man's burden, and if you're having any kind of difficulty getting at what is stated right here, it is through the teaching of the virtues of cleanliness. So once again, showing ignorant, savage, uncivilized people the right way. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, conquered folks eventually developed a consciousness. They rejected this notion of others exploiting and controlling them. They developed an ideology that reflected their own interest, their own sense of identity, and a strong notion of nationalism. And in the end, the overall colonial system collapsed. We'll pick up here next with an analysis of another factor or element that contributes to social inequality, ethnocentrism.